I was cruising at 500 feet over the amber wheat fields of southeastern Nebraska when I spotted her standing in her front yard, arms crossed, neck craned upward like some kind of furious flamingo. Even from that altitude, I could tell Brenda Morrison was about to make my life hell, which was really saying something considering I was living my absolute dream job. My name is Derek Sullivan, and I am a third-generation crop duster pilot operating out of Adams County, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and your reputation is either your greatest asset or your worst liability. The morning had started out perfect. Clear skies, light winds, and 600 acres of wheat that needed spraying before the aphid infestation got any worse. I had been flying this route for 3 years now, ever since I came back from my stint in the Air Force to take over my dad's agricultural aviation business. Dad had built Sullivan Aviation Services from nothing back in the 70s, and now it was my turn to keep the legacy going. The work was demanding, dangerous even, but there was nothing quite like the freedom of being alone in the cockpit of my air tractor at 802, skimming over the fields at dawn while the rest of the world was still rubbing sleep from their eyes. But Brenda Morrison had moved into the Whispering Pines subdivision about 6 months ago, and ever since then, my peaceful existence had been under constant assault. Whispering Pines was one of those cookie-cutter developments that had sprung up on the edge of town. All identical vinyl-sided houses with tiny yards, and an HOA that seemed to think they owned the entire county. The subdivision sat right on the border of the Jameson farm, which was one of my biggest clients, and apparently Brenda had taken it upon herself to become the self-appointed guardian of everything she could see from her kitchen window. I completed my pass over the wheat field and banked east to line up for another run. That is when my radio crackled to life. It was Tom Jameson, the farmer who owned the land I was currently treating. "Derek, you got a second?" His voice sounded tired already, and it was not even 8 in the morning. "Go ahead, Tom," I replied, adjusting my spray controls as I descended for another pass. "Got a call from that HOA lady again. She is threatening to call the sheriff if you do not stop flying over her neighborhood." I sighed. This was the 4th time this month. "Tom, you know I am not flying over the subdivision. I am flying over your land. She just happens to be able to see me from her house." "I know that, you know that, but she does not seem to care." She said something about noise ordinances and chemical exposure. Said she is going to make an official complaint. Let her complain. I have got every license and permit the FAA requires. I will finish this job and we can deal with her later. I clicked off the radio and focused on my work, but the morning's serenity had been thoroughly shattered. Brenda Morrison had already sent me 3 certified letters demanding I cease operations, had showed up at my hangar twice to lecture me about property values, and had apparently started a petition to ban crop dusting within 5 miles of any residential area. The woman had more free time than sense. I finished the Jameson job around 10:30 and headed back to my airstrip, which was a private strip on my family's property about 8 miles outside of town. My hangar sat at the end of a well-maintained grass runway, surrounded by nothing but open farmland and sky. It was heaven, or at least it used to be before Brenda Morrison made it her personal mission to shut me down. I was just finishing my post-flight inspection when a silver Lexus SUV came barreling down my driveway, throwing up a cloud of dust that made me wince. I did not need to see the driver to know who it was. Only one person in Adams County drove with that kind of aggressive entitlement. Brenda emerged from her vehicle like a storm system taking human form. She was probably in her mid-40s, with highlighted blonde hair cut in that severe bob that seemed to be standard issue for HOA presidents everywhere. She wore yoga pants and an expensive-looking athletic jacket, the uniform of someone who spent more time in coffee shops than gyms. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut steel, "we need to talk, right now." I wiped my hands on a rag and turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. "Mrs. Morrison, you are on private property. I do not care whose property I am on. You were flying over my neighborhood again this morning. The noise woke up half the subdivision, and I have 3 neighbors who are concerned about chemicals drifting into their yards. I was not flying over your neighborhood. I was flying over the Jameson farm, which is adjacent to your subdivision. There is a difference." She took a step closer, her face flushed with anger. "I do not care about technical distinctions. Your little airplane is a nuisance, and the Whispering Pines HOA has rules about nuisances. I am here to formally demand that you cease all operations within viewing distance of our community." I actually laughed at that. I could not help it. Within viewing distance. "Mrs. Morrison, from your subdivision, you can see for about 10 miles in every direction. Are you seriously suggesting I stop working within a 10-mile radius of your house? If that is what it takes, yes." She pulled a folder from under her arm and thrust it at me. "This is an official cease and desist order from the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors. We are prepared to take legal action if you do not comply." I took the folder but did not open it. "Your HOA has no jurisdiction over federal airspace or agricultural operations on private land. This is not worth the paper it is printed on. We will see about that. I have already contacted the county commissioners and filed a formal complaint. I have also been in touch with the EPA about your reckless spraying of toxic chemicals near residential areas." Now she had my attention. The EPA could actually make my life difficult if they decided to investigate, even though I knew I was following every regulation to the letter. The products I use are all EPA approved for agricultural use. I maintain detailed records of every application, including weather conditions, drift potential, and buffer zones. I am not doing anything wrong. That is for the authorities to decide, not you. She turned on her heel and started walking back to her SUV, then paused. "I am giving you 1 week to voluntarily ground your aircraft. If you do not, the HOA will take formal legal action. We will sue you, your business, and anyone who hires you. Your little crop dusting operation will be finished." She drove off, leaving me standing in the dust with her ridiculous cease and desist order in my hand. I walked into my office, a small converted room in the hangar, and actually read through the document. It was 8 pages of legal-sounding gibberish, citing HOA bylaws, county noise ordinances, and various environmental regulations. Most of it was completely irrelevant to my operations, but I knew enough about legal harassment to understand that this could still cost me time and money to fight, even if I was in the right. I called my lawyer, Richard Chen, who I had known since high school. He now practiced in Lincoln but still handled the occasional case for folks back home. "Derek, how is business?" Richard answered on the second ring. "Complicated. I need you to look at something." I scanned the HOA document and emailed it to him while we talked. "There is a woman in one of the new subdivisions who is trying to shut down my crop dusting operation. She is claiming the HOA has the authority to ground my plane." Richard was silent for a moment and I could hear him typing. "Okay, I am looking at it now. Give me the full story." I explained the situation, including all of Brenda's previous complaints and threats. Richard listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "This is fascinating, actually. I mean, it is complete nonsense, but it is fascinating that someone thinks this would work." The HOA has zero authority over federal airspace or agricultural operations on land outside their subdivision. Even if you were flying directly over their houses, which you say you are not, they still could not legally stop you. Airspace is regulated exclusively by the FAA. That is what I thought, but she is threatening to sue me and anyone who hires me. Can she actually do that? She can file a lawsuit. Whether it has any merit is another question. My guess is she is hoping you will just give up rather than fight it. Unfortunately, even a frivolous lawsuit costs money to defend. Let me draft a response letter explaining why her cease and desist has no legal basis. Maybe that will scare her off. And if it does not, then we prepare for a fight. But Derek, I have got to be honest with you. Even though you are clearly in the right, this could get expensive. HOAs can be incredibly stubborn, and if this woman has convinced the board to back her up, they might have significant resources to throw at this. I cannot just stop working, Richard. This is my livelihood. It is my family's legacy. I understand. Let me send this letter and see how they respond. In the meantime, document everything. Every flight, every conversation, every interaction with this woman. If this does go to court, we will need a paper trail. I spent the rest of the day doing exactly that. I pulled up my flight logs for the past 6 months and cross-referenced them with maps of the Whispering Pines subdivision. Not a single flight path went directly over the neighborhood. I was always over the adjacent farmland, which was perfectly legal. I also compiled my pesticide application records, showing the exact chemicals used, application rates, and weather conditions during each spray job. Everything was by the book. That evening, I drove into town to have dinner at Miller's Diner, the local institution where everyone gathered to catch up on news and gossip. I needed to talk to some of my other clients, several of whom I knew would be there. Sure enough, I found Tom Jameson, Bill Henderson, and Frank Kowalski sitting in their usual booth. They were all second- or third-generation farmers, men who had weathered commodity crashes, droughts, and floods, but who still managed to keep their operations going through sheer determination and hard work. "Derek," Frank waved me over. "We heard about your trouble with the HOA lady." Word traveled fast in a small town. I slid into the booth and ordered coffee from Sarah, the waitress who had been working at Miller's since before I was born. Yeah, she showed up at my hangar today with a cease and desist order. Says I have 1 week to stop flying or she is going to sue. Bill shook his head. "That is ridiculous. You have been spraying my fields for years. Never had a problem, never had any complaints until these subdivision people moved in. The problem is they think buying a house gives them control over everything they can see from their porch," Tom added. "I had the HOA president, that Morrison woman, call me last month demanding I stop using my tractor before 7 in the morning because the noise was bothering people. I told her I would stop planting crops when she started paying my mortgage." "What did she say to that?" I asked. "Said she was going to report me to the county for operating a commercial business in a residentially zoned area. I had to explain to her that my farm was here 50 years before her subdivision, and agricultural zoning trumps residential development. She did not like that." Frank leaned forward. "Here is the thing, Derek. That woman is not going to stop. She has already gone after Tom, me, and Bill for various things. She tried to get the county to pass an ordinance banning livestock within 2 miles of residential development. When that did not work, she complained about the smell from Bill's hog operation. Now she is after you because she can see your plane from her kitchen window. She will not be happy until every farmer in the county is out of business, and she has nothing but manicured lawns and coffee shops as far as the eye can see. So what do? You fight. Bill said simply, "and we will back you up. If she goes after you in court, we will testify about how necessary your services are. Hell, we will countersue if we have to. This is agricultural land and it was here first." Their support meant everything to me, but I knew that good intentions would not be enough if Brenda Morrison had the resources and stubbornness to drag this out. I needed to be smarter about this. The next morning, I had a spray job scheduled for Frank Kowalski's soybean fields. The fields were on the opposite side of town from Whispering Pines, so I figured I would have a peaceful day. I was wrong. I was halfway through the job when my radio crackled again. This time it was the county sheriff, Mike Patterson, who I had gone to high school with. "Derek, I need you to come down to the office when you are done with your current job. We need to talk about a complaint we received." My stomach sank. "Let me guess. Brenda Morrison, among others. Just come down when you can, okay? It is not urgent, but we need to address this." I finished the soybean field and flew back to my airstrip, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The sheriff's department getting involved was not good, even if Mike was a friend. He still had to take complaints seriously, especially if they involved potential safety or environmental issues. The Adams County Sheriff's Office was in Hastings, the county seat, about a 20-minute drive from my place. I cleaned up, changed out of my flight suit, and headed into town with a growing sense of dread. Mike met me in his office and he looked tired. "Derek, thanks for coming in. Look, I will be straight with you. Brenda Morrison and 3 other residents from Whispering Pines filed a formal complaint yesterday alleging that your crop dusting operations constitute a public nuisance, a health hazard, and a safety risk. They are demanding that we shut you down." "On what grounds?" "I have every license and permit required by law. I follow all FAA regulations. I maintain safe altitudes and buffer zones. What exactly am I supposed to have done wrong?" Mike held up his hands. "I am not saying you did anything wrong. But I have to investigate when complaints are filed. These people are claiming that you fly recklessly low over residential areas, that you have sprayed chemicals that drifted into their yards, and that you operate at unreasonable hours. That is all false. I do not fly over their subdivision at all. I fly over adjacent farmland. Any noise they hear is from legal agricultural operations on private property. As for chemicals, I maintain buffer zones that exceed EPA requirements, and I fly during standard agricultural hours, which are perfectly legal." "I believe you, Derek, but I need documentation. Can you provide flight logs, spray records, and anything else that proves you are operating legally? I can have everything to you by tomorrow morning. Richard Chen is already compiling it for the legal response." "Good. That will help." Mike leaned back in his chair. "Between you and me, I think this is a bunch of nonsense, but Morrison is well connected. She has apparently made friends with some people on the county board, and she is threatening to make this a major issue if we do not take her seriously. Just give me what I need to close this investigation, and say you are operating within the law." I left the sheriff's office feeling angry and frustrated. I had done nothing wrong, yet I was being treated like a criminal because some entitled HOA president did not like the reality of living next to agricultural land. This was farm country. Farming happened here. If she wanted pristine silence and chemical-free lawns, she should have moved to a suburb of Omaha, not rural Nebraska. Richard's response letter went out that afternoon via certified mail. It was a masterpiece of legal writing, calmly and methodically dismantling every claim in the HOA's cease and desist order. He cited federal aviation regulations, Nebraska agricultural statutes, and case law establishing that HOAs have no authority over airspace or agricultural operations on land outside their jurisdiction. He also noted that any continued harassment could constitute tortious interference with business relationships and left open the possibility of a countersuit. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. 2 days later, I received a call from the Federal Aviation Administration Flight Standards District Office in Lincoln. An inspector wanted to come out and review my operations. My heart sank. The FAA took complaints seriously, and if they found any violations, even minor ones, they could suspend my license. The inspector, a man named Gerald Matthews, showed up at my hangar the following Tuesday. He was professional and thorough, reviewing my logbooks, maintenance records, and spray application procedures with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made my palms sweat. I knew I was compliant, but there is always that nagging fear that you missed something, forgot to log something, or made some minor error that could come back to haunt you. After 3 hours, Gerald closed his notebook and looked at me. "Mr. Sullivan, I have reviewed everything, and I find no violations of FAA regulations. Your aircraft maintenance is current, your pilot certifications are valid, and your operating procedures are consistent with agricultural aviation standards. However, I do need to address the specific complaint that was filed." "What was the complaint exactly?" "The complainant alleges that you have been conducting reckless, low-level flights over a residential subdivision, creating excessive noise and potentially hazardous conditions. I need to verify your typical flight patterns and altitudes." I pulled out my GPS flight logs and showed him the detailed tracks from the past 3 months. "As you can see, I maintain appropriate altitudes for agricultural operations, typically between 3 and 10 feet over the crops during application, and 300 to 500 feet during transit between fields. I do not fly over the Whispering Pines subdivision. My flight paths are over adjacent agricultural land." Gerald studied the logs carefully, then pulled out a map and compared it to my flight tracks. After several minutes, he nodded. "This is consistent with what I am seeing. You are clearly not flying over the subdivision. The complaint appears to be unfounded. So what happens now?" "I will file a report stating that I found no violations and that the complaint was unsubstantiated. The FAA will send a response to the complainant explaining that agricultural aviation operations over farmland are legal and regulated by federal law. That should be the end of it from our perspective." "Should be." Gerald gave me a sympathetic look. "Mr. Sullivan, I have been doing this job for 15 years. I have seen situations like this before. You are caught between agricultural operations and residential development. Legally, you are in the right. Politically, it can still be a mess. My advice is to document everything, maintain your high standards of safety and professionalism, and do not let anyone bully you into giving up your livelihood." After Gerald left, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the FAA had cleared me, frustration that I had to go through the stress and disruption of an investigation in the first place. Brenda Morrison was costing me time, energy, and money, and she did not seem to care. The next development came 2 weeks later, when I received notice that the Whispering Pines HOA was filing a lawsuit against me in county court. They were seeking an injunction to prohibit me from conducting any aerial operations within 2 miles of their subdivision, plus damages for nuisance, emotional distress, and diminished property values. Richard and I met in his Lincoln office to discuss strategy. He spread out the lawsuit on his conference table, and we went through it page by page. "This is what I expected," Richard said. They are throwing everything at the wall hoping something sticks. The good news is that their legal arguments are fundamentally flawed. The bad news is that we still have to defend against this, which means time and money. How much are we talking about? If we can get this dismissed quickly on jurisdictional grounds, maybe 10 to 15,000 in legal fees. If they fight it and drag it out, could be 50,000 or more. I felt sick. That was real money, money I did not have just sitting around. Can we countersue for legal fees? We can try, but there is no guarantee we will get them. The court has discretion on that. However, I do think we have a strong case for sanctions if we can prove this lawsuit is frivolous and intended solely to harass you. What are our chances of getting this dismissed early? Very good, actually. The fundamental problem with their case is that they are trying to use HOA authority to regulate something that is exclusively under federal jurisdiction. It is like an HOA trying to regulate air traffic at O'Hare Airport. They just do not have the legal authority. We filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the court lacked subject matter jurisdiction because the FAA has exclusive authority over airspace, and that the HOA lacked standing to bring the lawsuit because I was not conducting operations over their property. We also filed a counterclaim for abuse of process and intentional interference with business relationships. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 weeks of uncertainty and stress. I tried to focus on work, but it was hard not to think about the lawsuit hanging over my head. Several of my clients expressed support, but I could tell some of them were nervous about being dragged into a legal battle. One farmer, who was considering hiring me for a new contract, decided to go with a company from Kansas instead. Brenda Morrison was already costing me business. About 3 weeks before the hearing, something happened that changed everything. I got a call from a reporter named Jennifer Wu from the Omaha World Herald. Someone had tipped her off about the lawsuit, and she was interested in doing a story about the conflict between agricultural operations and suburban development. Mr. Sullivan, I understand you are being sued by an HOA for crop dusting farmland adjacent to their subdivision. Is that correct? I hesitated. Talking to the press could backfire, but it could also help tell my side of the story. That is basically correct, yes. I am an agricultural pilot. I spray crops on farmland that I have been servicing for years. An HOA moved in next door and is now trying to shut down my business. Can you tell me more about the HOA's objections? I explained the situation, carefully sticking to the facts and avoiding any personal attacks on Brenda Morrison. Jennifer asked good questions about agricultural aviation, federal regulations, and the economics of farming. We talked for about 45 minutes, and by the end, I felt like she actually understood the issues. This is a great story, Jennifer said. It touches on property rights, agricultural preservation, suburban sprawl, and regulatory authority. Would you be willing to let me come out and observe one of your spray operations? I would like to see what you actually do. Sure. I have a job scheduled for tomorrow morning if you want to come out. Jennifer showed up at 5:30 the next morning with a photographer. I walked them through my pre-flight routine, explained the safety protocols, and showed them how I calculated spray rates and buffer zones. The photographer took pictures of my plane, the surrounding farmland, and the distant Whispering Pines subdivision visible on the horizon. That is how far away the subdivision is, Jennifer asked, shading her eyes as she looked toward the development. Yeah, about 3/4 of a mile from the nearest field I spray. I never fly directly over the houses. Their HOA president claims I am creating a nuisance, but as you can see, there is a significant distance between my operations and their property. The story ran in the Sunday edition of the Omaha World Herald, complete with photos and a headline that read, "Crop Duster Fights HOA Over Federal Airspace Rights." It was fair and balanced, presenting both sides of the issue, but the facts spoke for themselves. I came across as a hard-working agricultural pilot, just trying to do his job, while the HOA came across as overreaching suburbanites trying to shut down farming operations that predated their subdivision. The story went viral. Within 2 days, it had been picked up by agricultural news outlets, property rights organizations, and even some national news websites. My phone started ringing with calls from other farmers who had faced similar conflicts, aviation groups offering support, and even a few television producers asking if I would be interested in telling my story on camera. More importantly, the story caught the attention of the Nebraska Farm Bureau and the National Agricultural Aviation Association. Both organizations reached out offering legal support and resources. Suddenly, I was not fighting this battle alone. I was part of a larger conflict over agricultural rights and regulatory authority, and there were a lot of people who wanted to make sure I won. The hearing arrived on a bright Tuesday morning in late April. Richard and I met outside the Adams County Courthouse, a grand old building in downtown Hastings that had been there since the 1890s. I wore my best suit and tried to project confidence, even though my stomach was doing somersaults. Inside the courtroom, I saw Brenda Morrison sitting with her attorneys, 3 lawyers in expensive suits who looked like they spent more time in Omaha than Adams County. The HOA was apparently taking this very seriously, which was both intimidating and vindicating. They would not be spending this kind of money if they did not feel threatened. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided, a veteran judge known for her no-nonsense approach and her deep understanding of agricultural issues. That was good for us. She had grown up on a farm and understood the realities of rural life. Richard argued our motion to dismiss first, laying out the jurisdictional arguments clearly and methodically. He cited case after case establishing that the FAA has exclusive authority over navigable airspace, that agricultural operations on private land are protected by state agricultural right to farm laws, and that HOAs have no legal standing to regulate activities outside their subdivision boundaries. The HOA's lead attorney, a slick-looking guy named Preston Whitmore from Omaha, argued that the case was about nuisance law and property rights, not aviation regulation. He claimed the lawsuit was not trying to regulate airspace, but rather seeking compensation for the diminished use and enjoyment of HOA members' property due to excessive noise, chemical exposure, and safety concerns. Judge Hendricks listened attentively, occasionally asking pointed questions. When Preston tried to argue that crop dusting was inherently dangerous and should be prohibited near residential areas, she cut him off. "Counselor, are you aware that agricultural aviation operations are specifically authorized and regulated by federal law? Are you suggesting that this court should override federal aviation regulations?" Preston backtracked quickly. "No, Your Honor. We are simply asking the court to recognize that property owners have rights too, and that those rights can be protected through nuisance law. But Mr. Sullivan is not conducting operations on your client's property. He is operating over adjacent farmland with the permission of the landowner. How does that constitute a nuisance? The noise and potential chemical drift affect our client's property, Your Honor. That is sufficient for a nuisance claim." Judge Hendricks made some notes, then looked at Richard. "Counselor, do you have evidence regarding noise levels and chemical drift?" Richard presented the EPA reports I had compiled. showing that all spray operations were conducted within approved buffer zones, and that there was no evidence of chemical drift reaching the subdivision. He also presented decibel readings showing that noise levels at the subdivision boundary were well within county noise ordinance limits. The hearing lasted about 2 hours. At the end, Judge Hendricks took a brief recess to review the arguments and evidence. When she returned, she looked stern. "I am prepared to rule on the motion to dismiss. After reviewing the pleadings, evidence, and legal arguments, I find that the plaintiff HOA lacks standing to bring this action. Mr. Sullivan's agricultural aviation operations are conducted entirely on private property that is not subject to HOA jurisdiction. The operations are authorized and regulated by federal law, and the plaintiff has not demonstrated any actual harm that would support a nuisance claim. Furthermore, I am troubled by what appears to be an attempt to use litigation to shut down lawful agricultural operations. Agriculture is the backbone of this county's economy, and agricultural operations enjoy specific legal protections under Nebraska law. The plaintiff's motion for an injunction is denied, and the complaint is dismissed with prejudice. The defendant's counterclaim for abuse of process will proceed. That is my ruling." I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. Richard squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "We won." But we were not done yet. The counterclaim meant we still had to prove that the HOA had filed the lawsuit in bad faith, intending to harass me and interfere with my business. That would take more time and more legal work. As we left the courtroom, I saw Brenda Morrison in the hallway, her face red with anger. She started to say something to me, but Preston put a hand on her arm and steered her away. I was glad. I had nothing to say to her anyway. Over the next few weeks, Richard and I prepared our case for the abuse of process counterclaim. We gathered evidence of all Brenda's previous complaints, threats, and harassment, documenting a clear pattern of behavior designed to shut down my business. We also obtained testimony from other farmers who had been targeted by the HOA, showing that this was part of a broader campaign against agricultural operations in the area. The discovery process was enlightening. Through interrogatories and document requests, we learned that Brenda had indeed been coordinating with county commissioners to try to pass ordinances restricting agricultural operations. We found emails where she discussed strategies for making life difficult for local farmers, with the explicit goal of forcing them to sell their land for development. She had been in contact with several real estate developers who were interested in buying up farmland around Whispering Pines for future expansion. This was not about noise or chemicals or safety. This was about land development and money. Brenda and her allies wanted to transform Adams County from agricultural land into suburban sprawl, and anyone who stood in the way was a target. Armed with this evidence, we went into settlement negotiations. Richard made it clear that we were prepared to go to trial and seek not just compensation for our legal fees, but also punitive damages for intentional interference with business relationships. We had a strong case, and the HOA's attorneys knew it. The settlement took 3 weeks to negotiate. In the end, the Whispering Pines HOA agreed to pay $75,000 to cover my legal fees and lost business. They also signed a binding agreement acknowledging my right to conduct agricultural aviation operations on farmland adjacent to the subdivision, promising not to interfere with my business in the future, and agreeing not to support any local ordinances that would restrict lawful agricultural operations in the county. Most importantly, Brenda Morrison resigned as HOA president. The board issued a statement saying they wanted to focus on being good neighbors to the agricultural community and respecting the county's farming heritage. It was corporate speak, but it signaled a real change in attitude. The day after the settlement was finalized, I flew a spray job over the Jameson farm, the same fields that had started this whole mess. It was a perfect morning, clear and calm, and as I made my passes over the wheat, I felt a sense of peace I had not experienced in months. Below me, the land stretched out in all directions, a patchwork of fields and farms that represented generations of hard work and dedication. I thought about my dad, who had built this business from nothing and had taught me that flying was not just a job, it was a responsibility. We were not just spraying crops. We were helping to feed people, protecting the livelihoods of farmers, and preserving a way of life that was increasingly under threat from development and urbanization. As I banked for another pass, I glanced toward Whispering Pines. The subdivision looked small from up here, a tiny cluster of houses surrounded by thousands of acres of farmland. It was a reminder that despite all the growth and change, this was still farm country. Agriculture was here first, and it would be here long after Brenda Morrison and her HOA were gone. After I finished the job, I flew back to my airstrip and found Tom Jameson waiting for me. He had a huge grin on his face. "Heard about the settlement. That is fantastic, Derek. You did it. You stood up to them and you won." "We all won," I said. "This was not just about me. It was about protecting agricultural operations for everyone. Still, you were the one who had to fight it. A lot of guys would have just given up and moved on. You stuck it out." We walked into the hangar and I started my post-flight inspection, running my hands over the aircraft's wings and fuselage, checking for any signs of damage or wear. This plane was my livelihood, my connection to my father's legacy, and my ticket to the freedom of the sky. Brenda Morrison had tried to take that away from me, but she had failed. Over the next few months. Things slowly returned to normal. I continued flying spray jobs throughout Adams County and the surrounding area. My business actually grew, partly because of all the publicity from the lawsuit. Farmers who had been on the fence about using my services decided to hire me, wanting to support someone who had stood up for agricultural rights. I also started getting calls from other agricultural pilots around the country who were facing similar conflicts with suburban development. I shared my story and the legal strategies that had worked for me, hoping it would help others defend their livelihoods. Richard and I even put together a guide for agricultural operators dealing with HOA harassment, which the National Agricultural Aviation Association distributed to its members. Whispering Pines got a new HOA president, a retired school teacher named Margaret Foster who actually grew up on a farm. She reached out to me a few months after the settlement, asking if we could meet for coffee. I was skeptical at first, but I agreed. We met at the same diner where I had talked strategy with Tom, Bill, and Frank months earlier. Margaret was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mr. Sullivan, I want to apologize for how you were treated," she said as soon as we sat down. "What Brenda Morrison did was wrong, and it does not represent the values of most of the people in our community. A lot of us moved here because we wanted to be close to the land and enjoy a rural lifestyle. We understand that means living alongside agricultural operations. I appreciate that, Mrs. Foster. I never wanted to be at war with your neighborhood. I just wanted to do my job. I understand, and I want you to know that we are trying to educate our residents about what it means to live in an agricultural area. We are planning a community event where local farmers can talk about their operations and help people understand why things like crop dusting are necessary. Would you be willing to participate?" I was surprised and pleased. "Absolutely. I think that is a great idea." The community event happened in late summer. It was held at the Whispering Pines Community Center, and about 80 residents showed up. Tom, Bill, Frank, and several other farmers gave presentations about their operations, explaining the challenges of modern agriculture and the importance of crop protection. I talked about agricultural aviation, showing videos of spray operations and explaining the safety measures and regulations we follow. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in learning about agriculture. Several residents apologized for the conflict and expressed support for local farming. It was a healing experience, and it gave me hope that suburban and agricultural communities could coexist peacefully. One person who was notably absent was Brenda Morrison. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved away, selling her house in Whispering Pines and relocating to Omaha. I did not know if the lawsuit had anything to do with her decision, but I was not sorry to see her go. As fall arrived and the harvest season began, I found myself busier than ever. The phone rang constantly with farmers needing spraying services, and I added a second pilot to help with the workload. A young guy fresh out of flight school named Marcus, who reminded me of myself at that age, full of enthusiasm and passion for flying. Training Marcus gave me a new appreciation for how far I had come. When I explained the regulations and safety procedures, I understood them at a deeper level than I had before. The lawsuit had forced me to become an expert not just in flying, but in the legal framework that governed my profession. I was a better pilot and businessman because of it. One evening in October, after a long day of flying, I sat on the porch of my house looking out over the airstrip. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. My plane sat in the hangar, fueled and ready for the next day's work. Everything was as it should be. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. It was a news article about a proposed federal bill that would strengthen protections for agricultural aviation operations, clarifying that local governments and HOAs cannot restrict lawful aerial applications. The bill had been introduced partly in response to cases like mine, and it had strong support from agricultural organizations across the country. I smiled. Maybe some good would come from all this after all. Maybe my fight with Brenda Morrison and the Whispering Pines HOA would help protect other agricultural pilots from similar harassment. Maybe it would preserve agricultural operations for the next generation. I thought about my dad and what he would have said about all this. He probably would have told me that standing up for what is right is never easy, but it is always worth it. He would have been proud that I fought for the business he built and the way of life he loved. As darkness settled over the airstrip, I went inside and pulled out my flight schedule for the next day. 3 jobs lined up, all farmers I had worked with for years, all fields I knew like the back of my hand. It was going to be a good day of flying. The conflict with the HOA had taught me something important. My work was not just about spraying crops or making a living. It was about preserving agricultural heritage, defending property rights, and standing up to bullies who thought they could push people around. It was about maintaining the balance between progress and tradition, between development and preservation. I was a crop duster. I flew low over fields, applying chemicals that protected crops and helped feed the world. It was dangerous, demanding work that required skill, dedication, and courage. But it was also meaningful work, work that connected me to the land, to my community, and to generations of farmers and pilots who had come before me. Brenda Morrison had tried to take that away from me, hiding behind HOA bylaws and legal threats. She had wanted to ground my plane, to silence the engine that had been a soundtrack to rural life in Adams County for decades. But she had failed, because federal law was on my side, because I had support from my community, and because I refused to give up something I believed in. The FAA had told her exactly what I knew from the beginning. Airspace is not her jurisdiction. It belongs to everyone, regulated by federal law to ensure safety and fairness. No HOA, no matter how powerful or well-funded, can change that fundamental truth. As I closed up the house for the night, I felt grateful. Grateful for good friends like Tom, Bill, and Frank who had stood by me. Grateful for a skilled attorney like Richard who had fought for my rights. Grateful for a fair judge who understood agricultural issues and ruled based on law, not emotion. And grateful for the opportunity to do work I loved in the place I called home. The next morning, I was up before dawn, as always. The sky was clear, the wind was calm, and there were crops waiting to be sprayed. I walked out to my plane, completed my pre-flight inspection, and climbed into the cockpit. The engine roared to life, and I taxied down the grass runway, accelerating into the morning light. As I lifted off and banked toward the Kowalski farm, I felt the familiar rush of freedom that came with every takeoff. Below me, the land stretched out in all directions, fields and farms and small towns connected by dirt roads and long tradition. This was my world, the place where I belonged. Somewhere in the distance, the houses of whispering pines were just waking up. People were probably making coffee, getting ready for work, starting their days. Most of them would never know or care about the legal battle that had been fought over their right to complain versus my right to work. But a few might look up as I passed overhead, see my yellow plane against the blue sky, and understand that they were witnessing something important. Agriculture in action, a way of life preserved, a heritage continued. I descended toward Frank's soybean field and engaged the spray system. The chemicals began flowing, creating a fine mist that would protect the crop from the insects trying to destroy it. It was precise, technical work, but there was an art to it too, a rhythm and flow that came from years of experience. As I worked, I thought about the future. There would be other conflicts, other challenges, other Brenda Morrisons trying to shut down agricultural operations they did not understand or appreciate. Development would continue, subdivisions would expand, and the tension between rural and suburban communities would persist. But I also knew that as long as there were farmers who needed their crops protected, there would be agricultural pilots willing to do the work. As long as there were people who understood the importance of agriculture, there would be defenders of farming rights. And as long as there was federal law protecting navigable airspace, no HOA could ground a plane that had every right to be in the sky. I completed the pass and climbed for another run. The morning sun was fully up now, bathing everything in golden light. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind of day that reminded me why I loved this job, why I had fought so hard to keep doing it. As I made my final passes over the field, I keyed my radio to let Frank know I was finishing up. He responded with a simple "Thanks, Derek," but those two words carried a lot of weight. They represented trust, respect, and the bond between people who work the land and those who help them succeed. I flew back to my airstrip, already thinking about the next job, the next field, the next day of flying. The battle with the HOA was over, but the work continued. It always would. That was the nature of agriculture, the endless cycle of planting and protecting, growing and harvesting, season after season, year after year. As I approached my runway, I performed the landing checklist automatically, throttling back and lowering my airspeed. The grass came up to meet me and the wheels touched down smoothly. I taxied back to the hangar, shut down the engine, and sat in the sudden silence for a moment. This was my life. This was what I had fought for, and it was absolutely worth it.